very honored to have our guest speaker in class today. We recently watched the beautiful documentary, My Trip to Al-Qaeda, which was based on the best-selling Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Looming Tower. He went to high school in Dallas, Texas, and then continued his studies at Tulane University before teaching across the country in Cairo, Egypt, at the American University in Cairo. And he did that for 2 years. He's been a staff writer for The New Yorker since 1992, and previously he was with the Texas Monthly. Mm-hmm. And now he's doing a lot of work with different movies and plays and things along those lines. So Wikipedia said he also plays the keyboard, so that's pretty interesting.
My band has a gig at Jovita's on April the 9th, so you're all invited.
Thank you. Well, yeah. Well,
April the 8th. The 9th I'm leaving town, that's right. Yeah.
Well, great. Well, truly, he's an expert in his field, and as we've seen through all the different works that he's done and things like that. So we're very honored to have him. I'm sure he can explain himself a lot better than I can.
No, thank you, John.
But help me in welcoming Mr. Larry Wright.
Yeah, thank you. Well, this is fun to be here. I never had a class like this when I was young, and I didn't really know. I wanted to be a writer, but I didn't know what kind of writer to be. I thought I'd be a poet living in, the Greenwich Village with a beret. This is before I realized how much it costs to live in Greenwich Village and how little poets make, or how uninterested I am in poetry. But all of that, I just wanted to be a writer. And growing up in Dallas, that was like against the law. There were no writers. I mean, if you grow up in Paris or even Brooklyn, Chicago, the world is full of writers, and they've chronicled the place you come from. And there's a lot of value in that, because if you read the works of the people who've written about your hometown and your neighborhood, the kind of people you know, it helps you understand them. And there just wasn't any of that in Dallas. Nobody had ever taken the time to observe the city. And one of the first books I wrote was a memoir about growing up in Dallas during the Kennedy assassination. It was one of the most important things I ever wrote for myself, because it was a memoir, and I had to look back on my own life and report on myself and where I came from and who I was and what made me the person I am. Since you've all seen My Trip to Al-Qaeda, you already know about my method, and I have no hope that any of you will adopt it. I've been preaching, I've been evangelizing for years about the way that I go about acquiring my information. But I will show you, just to reinforce that. I'm working on a new story right now. I wrote an article about Paul Haggis, who is this writer-director who dropped out of Scientology recently. And so I'm writing a book now. And it's going to extend that article. It'll be more about the religion. But mainly it's about why people believe one thing over another. What draws them? I mean, this is an unusual country. It's not every country in the world that you can believe anything you want. I mean, if you're living in Muslim countries or very strict Catholic countries, pretty much your choice of belief is limited to one faith. Here, it's unbounded. In fact, you can create your own religion if you choose to. It's a really extraordinary situation. So, given that situation, why do people gravitate to one belief over another? And this is a question that's, since I guess the very beginning of my career, my first book was about the Amish. And I've written about Satanists, and you're the one that's doing Madeline, right? Or you're, okay. I've written about atheists. I've written about Southern Baptists. I wrote about Jimmy Swaggart. Of course, I've written a great deal about Islam, but I've always been curious about this fascinating element of the power of faith to form people's views And religion is really a much stronger force than politics, which gets all this attention. And religion has practically, no standing in the journalism world, but very interesting to me. Anyway, here I am on another project. And this is, if you've seen the film, familiar to you, but this is my latest. These are the names that I, collect when I start with Paul Haggis at the top, and I start gradually getting names and then getting their telephone numbers and highlighting their names when I talk to them. And, eventually this is going to be all filled up with names and people that I've talked to. That's how you acquire the names. When I go talk to somebody, I say at the end, who else should I talk to? And they give me more names, and that's why this list gets longer and longer. And when you finally get to the point when nobody can give you a new name, you realize you've touched bottom, and you have populated the whole universe. You can't do every name, but the mandate of journalism is to try to talk to as many people as you can. One thing that's often not said, though, is some people you want to talk to as often as you can, because there are some people who are just terrific resources. They're deep resources. They're very helpful. They're insightful. And they have the experience that can really help you along. Jamal Khalifa you saw in the film, he was that kind of guy for me. Somebody who was very close to bin Laden and could really help me understand the background and the motivations of somebody that I found very, very mysterious. So I talked to him many, many, many times. When I'm writing, the research isn't finished by that point at all, because suddenly you realize, well, I don't know the answer to that question. It occurs to you, you're writing and you're imagining what would the reader want to know here. And when you're out researching it as a journalist and you're pulling in all the information you can, some of the practical stuff hasn't occurred to you yet. The practical stuff is the mechanical stuff you need to put your story together, and there are gaps. And so you have to call your sources all over again and talk to them about, and oftentimes you get to a completely different level if you can enlist your source in helping you. I'm trying to do, I've got this problem. I don't understand why this occurred. I see that it did. We all talked about it. We watched it. I don't understand when I'm trying to explain it. I can't understand it myself, so you're going to have to help me understand it. And those are sometimes the very best interviews. I use legal pads. This is number 20 for the Scientology thing, and I tape my recordings. Eventually, I'll make a list of an index over here for the names that I've been of the people that are involved in this particular tablet. If I am talking to Paul Haggis 3 times in tablet 20, I'll have P. Haggis A, P. Haggis B, P. Haggis C, and that correlates with the tapes. I number the tapes, or the digital tapes now, and so that if I transfer it to my computer, it'll be Paul Haggis 20A. So I know the notes here. I can go directly to my computer if there's something I don't understand, or if the fact checker needs to listen to my recording to make sure he actually said it, then it's easy to find. The last element of this technique is, you've probably never seen note cards. This is the way that I was taught how to organize my composition papers and so on, and I spurned it, but I found when I started trying to write, my biggest problem was finding the stuff I knew. I knew somebody told me this fact. Who was it? Where did and what were the exact words? And I'd have to go through my notes or in newspaper articles or whatever it is, somewhere along the line. It would trip me up. And by the time that I got back to the typewriter at the time, I'd lost the inspiration. The motivation was gone. And I had to regain the energy and, you know, the original idea that was going to propel me through that narrative. So here's, for instance, L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, took off on a boat. In fact, he created a little navy for Scientology. And his ship was called the Apollo. And when I get around to writing about that, everything that has to do with the Apollo is on these cards. And this comes from a BBC documentary. This comes from one of the women that was on that ship. This comes from a letter somebody sent me. This comes from the web. These are interviews with people that were on the Apollo. And all of these things, you know, that we had, you know, one guy played on the band that was on the Apollo. We had 30 different uniforms, and he talks about a song that L. Ron Hubbard wrote, and a quote from L. Ron Hubbard telling his students, "I don't know what they expect, a God surrounded by an aura. All they see is this grumpy old man screaming at everyone." I'll use that quote. But, you know, I know how to find it. Of course it'd be on my computer and I'd be able to somehow thumb through it. But for me, just being able to have these things physically in front of me as I'm working, look down at them, it's very, very useful.
How are you typing those? Or are you?
Yeah, I have a
out?
template that is a note card template. And you can, you know, fill it out, and it knows the size of a note card. I also write them out because I might be sitting in bed reading a book, and I'll find something I want to write down. That's the basic information gathering technique, my technology. Then the other thing that I discuss with you has to do with storytelling. And maybe because I write movies, although I think this is true of all writing, all narrative writing, there are two really important elements to creating a gripping story, and they are characters and scenes. Now, characters, to me, they're like donkeys. I know it sounds like I'm making fun of them, but they're serviceable beasts of burden. A good character can take you into a world that the reader might not care about, except that he's interested in the character. For instance, John O'Neill, the figure in this book. He was the head of counterterrorism for the FBI in New York.
Let me stop you just to say, the one thing I forgot to tell you is they've read the O'Neill piece from the New Yorker.
The way I got onto that story was after 9/11. I knew I had to write about this, but how? For one thing, the planes were grounded. Remember, we couldn't go anywhere. I was stuck on the ground in Austin. I was desperate to get to New York, but I had to find a way to write about this immense tragedy. And how do you make something that vast meaningful and fresh to a reader who's overwhelmed with images on television and a commentary in the newspapers? The way that I've tried to approach it is to bring it all down to as human a level as possible. And I thought, out of those 3,000 deaths, there's going to be a story in there that will help me understand this. So I started looking at the obituaries that were streaming online at that point. And on the Washington Post site, there was this very brief obit about John O'Neill, who had been the head of counterterrorism for the FBI. It made him sound like a disgrace because, they talked about how he had taken this briefcase of classified information out of the office and had been cashiered from the FBI and wound up as head of security for the World Trade Center. And I thought to myself, the man who was supposed to get bin Laden didn't get bin Laden got him. That's a story. And I don't know if he's a hero or a villain, but he's a donkey. He can take us into the world of counterterrorism, and I can load up all the information the reader would ever want to know on the back of this character, because it was his world. And I had no idea when I decided I was going to write about John O'Neill what a character he would be. I mean, that guy, I was like on my knees in gratitude. It was, what a character. But all I knew was that he could help me take the reader into this journey. As I began to form the idea of the book in my head, I knew I also had to write about Osama bin Laden. But the Saudis wouldn't let me in, for like a year and a half. So during the interim, I decided I'll go to Egypt. I know Egypt pretty well, and I thought I'll write about the number 2 man in Al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri. There's another thing. Nobody was paying any attention to him. I had no idea. He was like the brains of the operation. And it was the fortuitous fact that the Saudis wouldn't let me in for such a long time that allowed me the time to go to Egypt and research this other guy. So I had 3 characters. And when I finally got into Saudi Arabia, and this was a chastening experience because the Saudis wouldn't let me in as a reporter, so I finally got a job. I got a job as the mentor to these young reporters in Jeddah, which is bin Laden's hometown. So instead of being a reporter in a hotel room making calls, hoping to I had an apartment, I had a car, I had a job I had to go to every day, and had all these delightful young Saudi reporters telling me so much more about their country than I could ever have learned as a reporter. It was it made me realize just how blind you are when you're parachuted into a place, as I so often am, and no doubt you will be as well, to be able to really sink into the culture for a long period of time and get to know people in a different way. And also I could assign them stories that to help me with my reporting. They were great. While I was in Saudi Arabia, I met Prince Turki Al-Faisal, who was the head of Saudi intelligence. And he had an interesting profile. He had gone to the university with Bill Clinton at Georgetown. He had worked with Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. And he was a member of the royal family. So I thought, another donkey. The whole story of the royal family and all this sort of thing, and the failure of intelligence in Afghanistan, this is my guy. I can load him up. And people are going to care about this information in a way they never would if it weren't for this elegant, intelligent, and maybe a little corrupt Saudi prince. So by interweaving these mutual biographies, that became the architecture of this book. Now I said the other thing was scenes. A good scene is the thing that creates the tension that causes the pages to turn. If you're involved in a scene and you have characters that the reader already cares about, then you're really creating the ideal situation for you as a writer, because it's fun to write those scenes, and for the reader who's captivated by the massive canvas that you're allowed to paint. In the documentary, for instance, I mentioned the Mosque Attack in 1979, which was for the Saudis like 9/11. It was, a huge national tragedy. Have these radical Muslims taking over the mosque. They had a shootout in the holiest place in the Islam. It was a horrifying experience, and significant for me because the bin Laden family built that mosque, and Osama was arrested after it. So when you know you have a scene, you report it. You think whenever you're interviewing anybody that might know anything about it. I keep another legal tab with questions that I'm going to ask, to make sure that I get them all. But the Mosque Attack might be one of 30 or 40 questions that I have. But you never know when somebody has something really pertinent to say about it. And I knew going into this that I was going to write about the Mosque Attack. And the more I learned about it, the more important that scene became. And then when I got to Prince Turki, and I asked him about the Mosque Attack, he not only was he there, he took off his royal robes and snuck into the mosque to do reconnaissance. This is a member of the royal family. When he arrived in Mecca, he was going in, he went into, he'd been in Morocco, he flew in back all night, and he goes to the site, and he's going into the command headquarters, and he starts to open this glass door, and a bullet rings out, and the door shatters in front of him. And I thought, what a great curtain raiser on a new character. This will be how I introduce Prince Turki. I find him in Morocco. Who is he? He arrives in Mecca. A shot rings out. You love it when a shot rings out. A shot rings out. Okay. Then when you get the reader engrossed, as you hope he is, and if a shot ringing out doesn't do it, then you're in trouble. But one thing you can do is pause. It's a good moment. There's a friend of mine who used to be the editor of the Detroit Free Press, and then he became a wonderful screenwriter. He wrote Absence of Malice and Out of Africa. His name is Kurt Ludke. He told me about the rubber band theory. And the rubber band theory is simply, if you pose a question in the minds of the reader, how's this going to turn out, for instance? Don't answer it right away. No, this is tension is what you want to create in the mind of the reader. So you have the rebels holed up in the mosque. You have a shot ringing out, and just barely missing the head of intelligence and a member of the Saudi royal family. You have the bin Laden family, Osama, trying to find out what's going on. Then you can stop for a moment and talk about, well, what is this relationship between the royal family and these religious zealots? What's the history of this? And the reader is going to digest this, because the more information you have about this, the more you'll appreciate the importance of this scene. But also, the reader is trying to get to the rest of the story, and it speeds up the reading process. You're gripped now, you're hooked, and you will swallow a lot more information than if I started to tell you in 1917, the king of Saudi Arabia, Abdulaziz, and forged this alliance. The context is entirely different. Suddenly it's pertinent. You have a character, you have a scene But what you really need is the information that will make this scene vital to your understanding of what's really going on there. So that's pretty much my spiel about gathering information and writing it down and trying to create a narrative. So why don't we talk a little bit about some of the problems that you guys are running into and see if some of these techniques might help.
Who's having a problem? No, but they're all doing just great. Evelyn, go for it.
My question is, how do you, at what point in the story do you decide to weave in their personal background? Because, I mean, most stories, you don't just squeeze it all into one thing. It's kind of woven in there. Like with O'Neill, his past, his relationships was way later in the story.
Right.
So, what do you suggest?
The first thing that you want to do with a major character is to signal to the reader, this is somebody we're going to pay attention to. Typically, Ian Forster wrote a book about the art of the novel, and he made a very interesting observation that I think is useful to writers of nonfiction as well. He talked about rounded characters and flat characters. A flat character is simply one who conveys information. You're quoting somebody. All you want from them is the information. You don't have to describe them. You don't have to notice them. In fact, if you notice them too much, then the information gets lost, and he begins to compete with actually important figures. So if you think of, the majority of your characters are simply walk-ons. They walk on the stage. But some people occupy the stage for most of your story, and they're your round characters. And so the first thing you want to do is signal to the reader, this is somebody we're interested in. And you might notice them in a way that you haven't noticed another character. You would, point out something about how they look, or their, the way that they say something. And then, as it becomes pertinent, you begin to feed in the personal stories. I knew, for instance, that John O'Neill's funeral was going to be a big, very emotional section of the book. But it also happened that he had 3 women who thought that they were engaged to him, and he had a wife and 2 children in New Jersey, and they all meet at the funeral. Well, so I have to prepare the reader by, explaining, his relationship with women and so on. And these beats are set into the story with the goal, eventually, of arriving at this funeral. And by that time, you understand what kind of man he is, that he's a very flawed character. I found another thing that with O'Neill, the same thing. I wrote this movie called The Siege, and Annette Bening plays a very corrupt, flawed CIA operative with a lot of blood on her hands, and she, in the movies, commits this almost unforgivable sin of sleeping with her source. But I realized she dies in the end. And anybody who dies in the end is forgiven. So John O'Neill dies in the end. And the count has been tallied up. I try to find out of course, my note cards, I have sections on their background, sections on their personality, sections on their education. And so when I get around to writing about them, first of all, noticing them in some distinctive way. And then as it, if I want to steer toward the character's observations about the Middle East, Well, I'll talk about the fact that this person had spent all this time, he'd studied Islamic history, this sort of thing. And so by the time the reader is there, and he's just, you know his qualifications. I think you want to know where you're headed with him. And so you use the material to support the direction that you're going. Yeah.
Sort of a challenge, I think, in our pieces are trying to sort of force this connection with our sources. And I'm kind of curious because obviously John O'Neill wasn't around to speak to.
Yeah.
Did you feel any less connected to him than you have with, like, let's say, Paul Haggis in this piece that you wrote?
Of course. I wish and the truth is when I wrote The Siege, I met a lot of FBI guys in his division. Yeah, I never met him. So my one chance was lost. And I really regret it. But I never met bin Laden either, or Zawahiri for that matter. They're all people that I had to report on through other sources. I would much rather have had the original sources to work with, but you work with what you can, and that's. I think knowing that I would never talk to them made me much more avid to get all the secondary information I possibly could to make it as strong as possible so that it would have the feeling of substance that you would otherwise have if you're actually talking to the person.
Going up from her question about relationships, we're taught that you need to build a trusting relationship with these sources so that you can bring them to life kind of whenever you're writing about them. But there's a difference between trusting them and being in their environment and putting yourself in danger or just doing crazy things to bond with this person. How safe did you feel when you were taking your driving lessons with a guy who made car bombs in the past? Did you think that was a good idea?
Well, I honestly, I never really felt in danger. Partly, I don't like to think about those things because I think if you get too preoccupied with, something might happen. Well, of course, something might happen, but the chances are that they won't. When I was in Saudi Arabia, it was during the Iraq War. Things were very tense. I did take some precautions. I changed my car a couple of times. I kept irregular hours. I don't think I really needed to, but I did. And, people told me I should live in a compound with all these other expats instead of in a middle-class Saudi flat. But when the bombs started going off, it was in the compounds, not in the middle-class Saudi flats. Occasionally, there would be moments when I wasn't really sure who I was talking to. And when I flew to Pakistan, that very afternoon, the first person I talked to was a guy named Khalid Hawaja, who, you remember Danny Pearl, the Wall Street Journal guy who got his head cut off? Marianne Pearl, his wife, holds Khalid Hawaja partly responsible for that. And he was a mysterious man. He, was close to the Taliban, close to bin Laden, and he worked for ISI, the Pakistani intelligence. He worked both sides. And he came over to my hotel room and said, I'd really like to have you to my house, but if you get killed, I'll really be in trouble. He turned out to be a terrific source, and that's why Danny had trusted him. You have to talk to the people who know, and sometimes the people who know, are like that guy with the driving instructor, have blood on their hands. But if you don't talk to them, If you can't, if you have the opportunity and you don't, then I don't think you're not in the right line of work. And also, one of the things is, you like them. I mean, when you're with them, typically, they're telling their story, you're being the sympathetic ear, and it's not till you get home and you start, adding up the judgments about, well, he did kill that little girl. Each person has an independent reality, and your job is to try to hear it and understand it. I'm not asking you to go out and get in danger. That's not. But I think, and reporting is dangerous. By the time you're my age, if you stay in this game, you will have a roster of friends that you've lost.
Do you speak Arabic? Did you learn it?
I studied Arabic when I was your age, practically. How old are you?
22.
When I was your age, I was in Cairo teaching for 2 years, and I studied Arabic for the fun of it. But they didn't teach us how to read it, and I didn't learn how to read until after 9/11. I hired a tutor. My Arabic is not great, but I can get around in it, and it's Egyptian. So when I speak Arabic in other countries, it's hilarious to them. It's like Cockney or something like that.
Was that difficult, or did any of your sources who are obviously like really anti-Western and have issues with Americans, do they feel like you're disrespecting them because you can't speak
Glenn and I were
English?
just talking about, we both interviewed this guy, Issam Al-Arian, who is a spokesperson for the Muslim Brotherhood in Cairo. Prick. He had just gotten out of prison, as he's always just getting out of prison. And he had an edge on him. This was February 2002, just a few months after 9/11. And I had an edge on me. I guess this was March, because I had been there for 3 months, and it was my next to the last day. And I thought, if somebody else wags his finger under my nose, I'm going to snap it off. I've just had it. There's so much anger towards America, and there were no Americans around. I was it, so a lot of venting took place, and I've been holding it in, but I was mad. I was upset too. And so Issam starts off on America, and he tripped over this stuff about the Suez Crisis in 1956, which seems so obscure. But it was one time when America did exactly the right thing. Eisenhower stopped the British and the French and the Israelis from stealing the Suez Canal. But in Issam's mind, we couldn't have done the right thing because we're America. So he has a whole different view of history. And I said, "You liar! You're telling people this." And we started shouting at each other, and it was a really angry conversation, not the only one that I had. The next time I went back, we were both cooler, and we had a very civil conversation. But as I was saying earlier in your office, I'm glad I had that, because I saw a part of him that he doesn't normally like to show. And it informed my view about who the Muslim Brothers really are. Yeah.
One of the most interesting parts of my trip to Al-Qaeda that I thought, and I brought this up in class the other day too, but I wanted to hear what you say. You said that when you're talking to a source, you have to see it through their eyes, or at least how they want you to think they see it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was wondering how you sift through what they actually think versus what they want you to think that they think. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I'm going through that now with Scientology. It's a very well-defended religion. it's ironic because they put so much effort into public relations and spinning, and they're the most stigmatized religion in the world. So their efforts aren't doing a very good job, I don't think. But the way in which they counter my queries to them, I have to parse their responses very carefully, because sometimes when they're saying you're wrong about this, the truth is they're saying I'm wrong about something very, very small, but it's applied to the whole assumption. And so you have to break these things apart, and the answer to your question is just, in this case, getting really, really basic and clear about, okay, well, that part's wrong, then is this right? Is that right? If it's wrong, in what way is it wrong? And then, well, show me the documents. Have you got anything to prove it? And then they give you, well, this document doesn't actually do what you say it does. What do you mean by this? And then you ask other people who are informed on the subject to help you understand it. And it's a long process of trying to assemble what is the most plausible truth. Fortunately for me, when I'm writing a book, I have lots of room in the footnotes or the endnotes to explain the different interpretations, the various quarrels that different parties have over the subject, so that I can write the text, the narrative, in the way that I think it went down. And of course, in this book, I'm talking to intelligence agents and terrorists. They're not exactly the most reliable sources, So you try to find other means of documenting what they say. It can be court records, contemporary newspaper accounts, and other people's testimony. And if someone tells you one thing and someone contradicts it, you go back to the person that told you the one thing. I understand that somebody else has a different perspective. Well, they may not actually be in conflict. It's your understanding that is not. You don't understand the context well enough to understand how both things can be true. That's often the case. But it's also true that if you go in and you're saying to people, and who else should I talk to? I got, let's see, who else? Let me get to the bottom of my list here. Just a second. Almost there. I'm getting there. Now, who else should I talk to? Well, I'd like to go back and that thing I said a moment ago, I just want to make a little amendment about that. Even FBI agents will do that. They see that you're, oh, wait a minute. He's serious. And, that's a great audio-visual aid. And by the way, you'll see that there are different highlights on it. That doesn't mean anything.
Okay, I was going to ask you there.
Okay, but people think it does. And it just, so when I started getting that question, because I just happened to have different highliners, people began to think, especially like cops and people like that have their own systems, that, he's got this whole thing figured out. And it only means that I had a different highlighter. But the main thing you want to do in that situation is just impress them with the fact that you're not going to stop. There's no, you don't have subpoena power or whatever, that would be helpful to a reporter. But what you can do is be as assiduous and serious as you possibly can in getting to as many people as you can. And that tends to keep people on good behavior.
What else, guys?
Yeah.
In my trip to Al-Qaeda, you said you were having dinner with Muslim extremists, and one of the dinner guests said he supports the beheading of all aides in Iraq.
Aid workers, yeah.
Yeah, and why did they agree to talk to you, and how did they know that you weren't a spy?
Well, I went in to this situation with one of my sources that he was a great source. You know, he was like a Qaeda historian who was in Birmingham, England. And it was during Ramadan. And we talked during the afternoon, and it got time to eat. So he took me to this Muslim grocery store, halal grocery store, where they also serve food. And we were sitting at a table, and these other guys joined us. And they were curious, because, you know, they knew my source, you know, but, you know, who's he talking to? So we're eating and, you know, talking a little bit, and, you know, one of them starts challenging me. And that's where that came up. You know, one of the things he said was that, you know, I talked about a little bit about, they asked me about Iraq, and I expressed my views about it. And then, you know, when he made that comment about beheading aid workers, it was infuriating. You know, it's hard to hang on to your objectivity sometimes. And it's not always worth it, maybe. I don't know. I try to be objective. I just, you know, I'd like to try to understand where he's coming from. If I just shout at him, I probably wouldn't get anywhere with him. And that's pretty much what his object was, I think, to discredit me in front of, you know, other people, like have this, force me into some stereotypical American reaction that would do me no good. Yeah.
So I'm kind of curious how you write about Al-Qaeda and now writing about Scientology. Do you sort of reach a point where you're like, okay, I've learned all I can learn for this right now, and then move on to something and maybe come back to it later on? Or what even, like, how do you even get interested in a topic in the first place? Is it something that just kind of comes out of nowhere sometimes?
To me, that's the most mysterious part of the whole writing game. You know, why are you writing about this, not that? And you know, sometimes editors propose stories, and I am not interested. You know, or you stumble on something, you know, in the newspaper, and you think, oh man, you know, I can't wait to get started on writing about that. And I've been doing this long enough that I've finally observed some patterns in my own behavior, and you know, things that I'm interested in, beliefs in religion. I don't know why. You know, I was a religious teenager, but I'm not now. I like to write a lot of different forms, and personally, I don't really care very much about what form it is. I think that ideas often come to you like gifts, and you know, but they arrive as, "Hi, I'm a magazine article," or you know, "Hi, I'm a novel." You know, you don't want to have, "Hi, I'm a poem," because that's not going to, you know, I've found out the poetry thing doesn't work for me. But, you know, "Hi, I'm a screenplay." But, you know, a lot of times the truth is that, you know, I've found that topics can be treated in different ways. Just as I wrote a book and a play and a documentary about pretty much the same material. I wrote a novel and a movie about Manuel Noriega. You know, but initially you think you know what the form is, and each form has advantages and liabilities. The book, in a way, is the most complete statement, but I'm not in it. It's not personal. It's not meant to be. It's a history. after I finished writing it, people wanted to know, well, what was it like? What did you feel like? And I thought there's some value in telling people what the experience is like so they would identify with a person from their community going out and being a witness and experiencing and feeling much that they might have felt had they been in that spot. And that will help them identify and understand the situation in a way that's different from that. And a stage play is a pretty modest way of spreading the news because, you're only going to talk to so many people each night. It's a little, I think, like being the original reporter. And I imagine the original, this is my conception, is that we're all sitting around a campfire. And somebody says, what's over the hill? And somebody says, well, I'll go find out. And he goes over the hill and he comes back and he stands in front of the fire and he starts telling about what he saw over the hill. Well, it's a little like what you feel like when you're on the stage because you can barely see people out there, and you're describing what the experience was like. I've been very interested in taking journalism into different forms. And the theater is one thing. I told Glenn I did this other one-man show about Gaza called The Human Scale in October off-Broadway. And in May, we're taking it to Israel and Cairo. I have no idea how they're going to receive it because it's pretty hard on both sides. But it's one way of addressing this awful problem, which is the Israeli-Palestinian stalemate that has caused so much damage, not just locally, but all over the world. And trying to persuade them in some way to acknowledge the dangerousness of their situation and get past their complacency and anger. That's what this play is about. Diplomacy hasn't worked. I'm not sure that theater is going to solve it, but there's almost no other way of, it's hard to talk to Palestinians and Israelis in any circumstance, but in journalism, at least you can say, these are the facts, and here's the narrative that I see, and so it might help frame their thinking in a fresh way. That's my goal.
What's the big difference? Is there a big difference between writing a long-form piece and then putting it on the stage? Is there? You talked about scenes and characters. Obviously, what you've done on stage is use first person to sort of drive things along. You're still using chronology in both forms. It seems clear. But what would you say is the biggest surprise in making that transformation?
Calvin Trillin is a colleague of mine at the New Yorker, and here's how I got into the theater business. This will start with another of my friends, John Lahr, who was just here. He's the drama critic for the New Yorker. And he said, well, you finished your book. What are you going to do now? And I said, John, I'm sick of writing about terrorism. I'd like to write a musical comedy. And I can't afford it. It's not a problem. I know Andre Bishop at the Lincoln Center. I'll call Andre. He'll commission it. So he calls Andre, and I go over and, because he's the drama critic for the New Yorker, Andre sees me. And I tell him my idea, and his eyes roll. And then I said, I had this other idea about a one-man show, and about my experiences in the book. And he said, well, that's where your energy is. You should do that, which was another way of saying, I'm not going to do the other one. So I go back to the New Yorker, and I ran into the director of promotions, Rhonda Sherman, and I told her what Andre said, she said, well, I'll produce it. We'll do it at the New Yorker Festival in October. I'll get Greg Mosier, the 2-time Tony winner, to direct it. So within an hour, I had a producer, a director, and a date to open 3 months later, and no script. And so that's when I went to Bud Trillin, and who had done a one-man show himself. And I said, you got any ideas? I mean, what are your suggestions? He said, use props. And I realized that was very important, just not stand up there by yourself. This is an opportunity to roll in music, videos, pictures, anything that you weren't able to put in here. All this stuff that will make it more real to the audience. And in this recent play, the reason I did it really is that I had seen some video that was so unnerving to me, and I spent a lot of time there. But I'm sure you've seen this stuff. But the Hamas children's television shows, and the picture of the video on the beach of that girl's family that got killed by an Israeli bomb, and things that just set that region on fire, but we never get to see. And I thought, well, if I haven't seen it, I'll bet very few people are really familiar with this. And so I had written a piece for the New Yorker about Gaza, but I couldn't put any of that stuff in there. And on the stage, I could. So it's just a different form. And it's more intimate, and also, I think, a little more frightening for the audience when, for two things. One, they're seeing this stuff, and two, they're afraid you're going to forget your lines. Which can happen.
Anything else? Well, the only other thing I want to add, is just that, notice when Larry first started talking, and he was talking about Paul Haggis and working on the Scientology thing and moving on, first thing he was talking about, as I recall, was what's the story really about? Belief, and he went into that. And that, I don't know if that rang true for the rest of you, but I keep asking these folks, what's your story really about? What are you trying to get at? So it never stops, but, that's the first thing he mentioned, and that's the most important thing in a way, isn't it?
Why? That's the reason you're telling this story over another one.
Yeah.
And it's, it's a privilege to be able to do this. To go out and collect people's stories and explore life in a way that most people never have the opportunity. You can do, as you were saying, anything you want. It's great. It's a license. It's a passport into any form of life you'd like to see. And it's an education, too, because, in order to write about something, you have to learn about it. And to write a book like that, it's like a PhD. You've got your doctorate in Al-Qaeda now, but you know something that that's in some ways unique to you, but you've had to learn. People all over the world are teaching you what you need to know. And I don't know of any other form of life where you can, any other career that you can go out and presume to talk to anybody about anything. But this is one line of work where you have that privilege.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.